But here's an example case, one of the 2 or 3 classic cases from evolutionary psychology. It's a question of mate attraction strategies. And it comes from, this work in particular comes from a psychologist named David Buss at the University of Texas, unless you've moved, Professor Buss. The idea is that mate attraction has been a problem to be solved across the course of evolution in the same way that getting food is a problem to be solved. It's a problem to be solved in an evolutionary way because, of course, if you don't attract a mate, then you don't reproduce. Your genes don't enter the system. If everybody fails to do that, there's not a lot of species going on unless somebody quickly invents some cloning. Since that's a problem to be solved, there may be a mechanism to solve it. And again, this is a very specific idea. In the same way that eating food and getting it to be digestible is solved through mechanisms like teeth and a digestive system, attracting mates may be solved by an evolved mental module dedicated to solving that particular problem. In this case, there's reason to expect that there would be gender differences in the way the problem is solved. The reason behind the gender differences comes, well, most clearly spelled out. It's a little obvious once you spell it out, by an evolutionary biologist, Robert Trivers, in something called parental investment theory. As I always say, whether in class or in a film studio, I'm just the messenger here. This is not my idea. The reminder here, though, is that from Trivers, is that men and women have, in some sense inherently, different levels of investment in parenting. So reproduction, a child, for the mother is a huge, big investment. The mother is pregnant for 9 months. It saps a lot of energy to be pregnant. And then, if things go well, there's the child who you have to care for, feed, nurture, nursing for a long period of time after the child's birth. And except in the relatively rare case of twins, this is occurring for only one child at a time. So it's a huge biological investment. However, the male does not necessarily, in the biological necessities of the sense, again, Trivers remind us, have the same kind of investment in parenting. Oh, is it? Oh, it's picking that up, even though the directional.
Yeah, I can watch the
Why don't you ask them to stop?
I will check
I was at a convention a few months ago where a band started playing, and we were able to get the band to stop. It was like a street band in Amsterdam outside the lecture window, and the organizers, I don't know what they did. They may have given them a bunch of money. They were just street performers.
Right.
They may have given them a bunch of money to play on a different street.
That works. So make sure that they're leaving. All right, this should go.
Trivers reminds us that by comparison, males do not have the same necessary investment in parenting. In principle, the male could be a parent, I'm not suggesting this, could be a parent of multiple children at once with multiple women and not check back in, and could have low psychological and biological investment in large numbers of pregnancies, whereas a woman can be part of only this one pregnancy and necessarily has a large amount of investment. This suggests to Trivers and David Buss that men and women naturally would have evolved, that's their idea, different preferences with regard to seeking a mate. The idea here is that with their large time, energy sapping investment in parenting, women would be seeking men who are able to support, including quite literally, economically, with status and wealth, support the mother and child, whereas men don't need to be seeking economic support because they don't have the same investment in parenting. However, they might be seeking the extreme simplicity of women who are youthful enough to have a child. The prediction, then, is that men, in response to women's desire for men who have status and wealth, would tend to display status and wealth, would tend to do things. This, to put it simply, is an evolutionary biology explanation for why on the first, and maybe even second a date, men would tend to pay for dinner. Normally you might think it's a social thing where the father said, well, son, pay for dinner, and here's $5. But the idea here is that you still want to explain why it is that parents are more likely to say to the male child, son, pay for dinner. That may be, so the story of Trivers and Buss goes, because over the course of evolution it was adaptive for men to display wealth, to display the fact that they can pay for dinner and have more money in their wallet and have a large, powerful car and might have a good job, than it was for women, because women were interested in male displays of status and wealth. And conversely, it may make more sense for women to, for example, dress in a way that displays youthful fitness than for men, because men had the preference for women who display youthful fitness, and therefore women, so this argument goes, have evolved a tendency behaviorally that matches the preferences historically of men and vice versa for men and women. Now, the research method here is very straightforward, and maybe so straightforward that it's quite a large leap from the evolutionary story to the data. The research method is that Buss uses is to ask people about tactics they used when attracting a mate. Yes, this does take some of the romance out of things. The language here is that, it's a dating game, as they used to call it on the TV show Dating Game, and that there are tactics for trying to win the game. The win is to attract a mate, and so that's the unromantic language that's being used here. So what he does is to get a bunch of people who are in a long-term committed relationship and ask them what they did. It's a list of like 300 of these behaviors, and they check off what you did when trying to make yourself attractive to the other person with whom you're now in a relationship. There's also a second measure, which is flipped, of the things your now mate did, how effective were they? So there's a list of behaviors and which ones were effective. The tactics are like this. They're not terribly surprising. Women, more than men, dieted to improve their figure, wore stylish clothes, wore facial makeup, smiled a lot, and got tan. Yes, you already know that might happen in a Western society in which there are men and women. But the point is, of the evolutionary analysis, is that virtually all these things make you look younger. I'm guessing that if you women out there shop for clothes and makeup, and you put them on, and you look way, way older, then you are less likely to buy the product. Yes, makeup is great. I look like I'm 82. Similarly, if you smile, you look younger. That's just a general principle of perception that's actually explained in Gibsonian perception, because there's a natural lawful thing which involves gravity. Gravity causes things to sag. So if you see a sofa in an apartment and it's drooping down, it looks older than if it's brand new. There's everything that sags looks older than things that don't sag. And so smiling causes the facial muscles that causes things to go up, and people look younger when smiling. Men, more than women, did things like lifted weights, some sign of power and strength and status. I mean, in the evolutionary landscape, at the very least. In fact, they paid for dinner and at some restaurant that was seen as nice. Men are more likely to be driving around in an expensive car. So if you're out there and you've just spent a whole bunch of your money for a car that goes way faster than you're actually allowed to drive it, and if you're ever asking yourself, why did I spend the extra $9,000 for a car that I'm not allowed to drive at its top speed limit? The story here is that you evolved that tendency towards a display of power and status that happens to run through the world of cars in our society. Men flashed a lot of money. The tactics differ rather precisely in the way that's expected by the evolutionary analysis. And everything looked fine at first, until it was noted that there was cross-cultural data, thanks to David Buss very much, and that there might possibly be cultural differences. Two psychologists, by the way, before I get there, the preferences fairly much match this. I mean, women see it as effective that men have money, and men see it as effective that women wear stylish clothes. Other things are also effective, not expected by the evolutionary analysis. Both men and women find interest in me and display a sense of humor, not predicted by the evolutionary analysis as being effective. So depending upon who you are, the tip is to do these things plus display a sense of humor. Getting back to this, though, two psychologists, Alice Eagley and Wendy Wood, realized that with a cross-cultural database, it's possible to test out something that is a potential problem in the evolutionary psychology analysis that was just up on the board in the last couple of minutes. The problem, and in phrasing it generally, is that the analysis that was just up there treated men and women as essential categories, is the fancy social science language for this, as if you really learned the core thing about the person by knowing that they're male or female. However, it might be that there are other core things about a person that merely happen in our world to be correlated with being male and female, and that some other feature explains what's going on. One of the other features that might be relevant is economic power. We live in a world, certainly if you're seeing this in North America, Western Europe, wherever region of the world, all viewing this film, we're living in a world in which women make less per hour per unit of job than men doing the same job, and in which, despite enormous changes over the past century, I mean, one of the largest things that has changed is the role of women. So I think things are going in the right direction. But it's still the case that if you attend a board of directors meeting of a giant corporation or have a gathering of CEOs of companies, the room won't be like overwhelmingly filled with women. It's still the case at upper echelons that there are glass ceilings, that there's less influence and power. There are economic differences. It might be, hypothetically, that any groups of people who differ in economic welfare, whether they're men, women, people from North or South Dakota, people whose names start with A through M or N through Z, for any subgroup of people, if one group had more economic wealth than the other, then the group with less economic wealth might be interested in finding a mate who had more money, based not on some deep, evolved, over hundreds of thousands of years reason, but just on a kind of normal, everyday, rational logic, which is that if you don't have much money and you're going to find a mate, it would be nice if the person had a lot of money. And that would be less relevant if you already have a lot of money. So what happens is that Eagley and Wood reanalyzed these data sets that come from multiple nations by paying attention to an index of gender equality. It turns out that not all nations are the same in the way in which men and women are equal or unequal in pay, income, and total financial assets. There are some places of the world, and I don't have them all memorized, but I believe some of the good ones are in very northern Europe, in which the differentials economically between men and women are rather small, and others in which the economic differentials between men and women are larger than in the United States. And our friends in the United Nations have already figured this out, and there's the United Nations Index of Economic Equality. What Eagley and Wood do is to relate the economic index of gender equality to preferences in mating. Here's a case in the world of psychology where there's clear-cut different theoretical predictions. According to evolutionary psychology, there shouldn't be any difference from one part of the world to another as a function of gender equality, because all humans have evolved the same bunch of mental mechanisms. Looking for cultural differences in preferences in mates would be like looking for cultural differences in numbers of fingers on the hand. It's already evolved the hand over the hundreds of thousands of years. Only in the last couple tens of thousands of years did people get out of Africa and populate the globe, but they took their hands with them, so to speak, and so that's a fixed thing. However, it's possible it's not a fixed thing. It's possible instead, more of a sociocultural explanation, that this being the degree to which there are gender differences in mate preferences, this is going to vary culturally, and what Eagley and Wood find is not just something, but really fairly strong correlations in the order of and sometimes 0.4 to 0.6, these being correlations between gender empowerment. N equals 33 does not mean 33 people, it means 33 nations here. Across nations who differ in gender empowerment, there's a correlation between gender empowerment and, to take the large correlation first, the degree to which people care about mate being a good cook. Well, if you live in some hugely differential society where men have a lot of power, and imagining just being at work and then coming home and having some woman who's come up with a fine roast beef, then there may be gender differences in interest in mate who can cook. But those gender differences go down when gender empowerment goes up. Gender differences in caring about earning capacity go down as gender empowerment goes up, so that if you find societies in which people are relatively equal in income, it's no longer the case that women are more interested than men in the degree to which the mate can bring in a lot of money. So in a domain in which there should, based on evolutionary analysis, be nothing happening in terms of cultural differences, there's a whole lot happening. And historically, now this Eagley and Wood paper is a few years old. Well, first, the summary here. So in societies that have more economic power, the male-female differences, rather than being fixed and evolved, are variable across cultures. And this sort of thing has, as Eagley would point out, this is contrary to the evolutionary psychology, which is why I said this really raises two things. One is that it's hard to make these general claims about human nature and nature versus nurture unless you have cross-cultural evidence from multiple cultures. Any of you majoring in anthropology and tuning into a psychology course have been thinking throughout the semester that, hey, a lot of these people are from North America, and in my anthropology class, they're from Bali. In fact, psychology has figured that out and is much more culturally attuned than it was in the 20th century. But in fact, a lot of the ideas of the 20th century were uni-culturally based when you want multicultural data. The more general lesson, before moving on, the more general lesson is that the entire understanding of psychology, of evolution and behavior has changed in the 21st century, just as the understanding of genetic mechanisms has, and they kind of go hand in hand. Once you know that genetic mechanisms, the sheer biology of the organism, is influenced by behavioral experiences, such as the parenting behavior and behavioral outcome study in the first part of these nature-nurture lectures, then you realize that things are not just as wired in by evolution as you thought. Instead, it appears that evolution has given us certain preferences and also a mind that's extremely adaptable and variable. Humans, even over the last couple of 10,000s of years, encountered extremely varying landscapes, especially when getting out of Africa and encountering different kinds of environments. And it appears now that one of the hallmarks of the mind isn't just the evolutionary psychology one of the 1990s, certain fixed preferences as a function of evolution, but instead a huge adaptability to whatever challenges are presented in the environment, as is much more appreciated now in the 21st century.